The lockdown began not with sirens, not with announcements, not with the visible machinery of royal security that the public recognizes as crisis response. It began with silence. At 6:14 am on a Thursday morning, every electronic communication system within Windsor Castle's private archive wing was simultaneously disabled. Mobile signals were jammed, internal networks severed, landlines isolated. Staff present in the building were instructed to remain at their stations without external contact. No one entered, no one left.
The archive wing, normally accessible to authorised researchers and senior household staff during designated hours, became a sealed environment governed by protocols typically reserved for active intelligence threats or sovereign medical emergencies. But there was no threat, no emergency, only a discovery. A discovery made 3 hours earlier by 2 junior conservators conducting routine environmental monitoring in Sublevel 3, the deepest and least accessed section of the Windsor archival vault. They had found, behind a false panel in a storage alcove that appeared on no blueprint and matched no known renovation record, a steel lockbox, unmarked, sealed with wax, bearing a cipher that had not been used since 1996, and inside that lockbox, wrapped in acid-free tissue and enclosed in a moisture-proof sleeve, were 7 letters, handwritten, in Diana's unmistakable script, addressed to no one, dated across the final 18 months of her life, written in a personal shorthand that archivists had long suspected existed but never confirmed. Letters that had been hidden deliberately, preserved meticulously, and discovered entirely by accident. Letters that, when decoded over the following 48 hours in that sealed archive wing, contained truths so intimate, so institutionally destabilizing, so personally devastating to the man who now wears the crown that when King Charles read them in that same sealed room at 3:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, he did not speak, did not move, did not call for assistance. He simply sat at the archive reading table, holding his dead wife's words in hands that trembled with a grief 30 years suppressed, and wept with a totality that no courtier, no archivist, no protection officer present had ever witnessed from a reigning sovereign. Not ceremonial tears, not public emotion, private, unmediated, utterly human devastation, the kind that comes not from loss newly experienced, but from truth finally received. Truth that should have been spoken decades ago, truth that was hidden because speaking it would have shattered the institution, truth that now, decoded in a locked room by archivists who never expected to find it, has shattered something anyway. Not the institution, the man. And in that shattering, perhaps, the beginning of something the institution has needed for 30 years. Honest reckon. Before we reveal what Diana wrote in those 7 letters, what she documented about her marriage, her motherhood, her institutional isolation, and her hopes for sons she feared would be consumed by the very system that was consuming her. Before we walk through the decoding process that transformed shorthand into testimony, and before we describe the conversation Charles had with William after reading the letters, the conversation that reshaped both men's understanding of what Diana endured and what the monarchy owes her memory, make sure to hit subscribe to and turn on the notification bell. Because this story is not about scandal. It's not about exposing secrets for public consumption. It is about a woman who wrote in code because she knew her words would be intercepted if written plainly, who hid her truth because she knew the institution could not receive it while she lived, who trusted that someday someone would find what she preserved and understand what she could not say. And it is about a king who, 30 years after failing to hear his wife's truth when she spoke it, finally received it in the only form she could safely leave it, and who, in receiving it, broke open in a way that may yet allow the institution he leads to break open too. To understand why these letters required a palace lockdown, we must first understand what they are and what they are not. These are not diary entries, not journal reflections, not casual correspondence. They are deliberate testimonies, composed with the precision of someone who understood that her words might outlive her and who intended them to serve as evidence, not merely expression. Diana developed her personal shorthand in early 1996 after discovering that her private papers were being routinely reviewed by household staff acting under instructions from senior courtiers. She did not confront those responsible,
She adapted. She created a substitution cipher based on a children's poetry anthology she kept on her nightstand, a book unlikely to attract scrutiny, its contents seemingly innocent. Each letter of her alphabet corresponded to a word from specific poems. Sentences were constructed through sequential word references. To the untrained eye, her coded letters appear as lists of unrelated words. To someone possessing the key, the anthology itself, which was found in the same lockbox, they decode into coherent, grammatically precise prose. The coding is not sophisticated by cryptographic standards, but it was sufficient. Sufficient to protect her words from casual inspection. Sufficient to preserve her truth until someone with both the key and the willingness to use it came looking.
Or stumbled upon it, as the conservators did, by accident, by chance,
by the grace of a moisture sensor, triggering an alert in a wall section that should have been solid brick. The 7 letters span from February 1996 to June 1997. They are not chronological, they are thematic. Each addresses a distinct dimension of Diana's experience during the most isolated period of her life. Letter 1 documents surveillance, specific instances of phone tapping, mail interception, and room searches, including dates, methods observed, and names of staff involved. Letter 2 addresses institutional gaslighting, systematic efforts by senior courtiers to portray her concerns as instability, her requests for support as manipulation, her maternal instincts as interference. Letter 3 records restrictions on access to her children, occasions when scheduled time with William and Harry was cancelled or supervised without explanation, when her input on their education and welfare was overridden, when her presence at family events was managed as optics rather than honoured as motherhood. Letter 4 describes psychological pressure, coordinated leaks to sympathetic journalists, orchestrated narratives designed to undermine her credibility, deliberate isolation from support networks outside the palace. Letter 5 documents her charitable work being undermined, patronages reassigned without consultation, initiatives blocked by administrative obstruction, public appearances scheduled to minimize her visibility. Letter 6 addresses her fears for her sons' futures, her terror that they would be molded by the same institutional forces that were breaking her, her desperate attempts to instill in them values counter to institutional norms. Her awareness that her death would be weaponized to sanitize the system she was documenting. Letter 7 is addressed directly to William and Harry, though never sent. It is the most personal, the most raw, the most institutionally dangerous. In it, Diana writes not as princess or icon, but as mother. She tells them what she could not say aloud, what she feared saying even in uncoded writing. She tells them she loves them beyond the institution's capacity to contain or corrupt that love. She tells them she sees the machine shaping them and grieves her inability to stop. She tells them that if she does not survive, they will be told she was unstable, difficult, the author of her own destruction. She tells them this is a lie. She tells them she was silenced. She tells them to trust their own perceptions over institutional narratives. She tells them she wrote these words so that someday, somehow, they might know the truth their mother could not speak. That she was not mad, she was muzzled, not broken, buried, not the problem, the proof. The decoding took 48 hours, conducted in the sealed archive wing by 3 senior archivists cleared for sensitive material, working under strict confidentiality protocols. They used the poetry anthology found in the lockbox as the cipher key, cross-referenced Diana's shorthand against the text, reconstructed sentences word by word, verified coherence through contextual analysis, confirmed authenticity through handwriting comparison, ink dating, and paper stock verification. Every decoded passage was double-checked. Every uncertain transcription flagged. Every emotionally charged section handled with archival care and human reverence. This was not forensic extraction, it was sacred recovery. The archivists understood, as they worked, that they were not merely translating symbols, they were receiving testimony. Testimony from a woman who had trusted that her words would survive her silence, who had believed, against all evidence available to her in life, that truth mattered enough to preserve, that someday someone would listen. The archivists listened, with professional discipline, with human compassion. with the weight of knowing that what they were recovering had been buried for reasons that still operated within the institution they served. When the decoding was complete, the senior archivist compiled a bound transcript, plain text, no commentary, no annotation, just Diana's words, rendered in English in the order she wrote them. She placed the transcript in a sealed folder, walked to the secure phone on the archive wall, dialed the number only 4 people possessed, said 5 words. He needs to see this. 90 minutes later, Charles was sitting alone in that sealed room, holding the transcript, reading his dead wife's truth in the silence of a lockdown archive. What Charles read broke him, not gradually, not partially, completely. The letters did not confirm suspicions he'd harboured. They articulated realities he'd participated in suppressing. He read about surveillance he'd been briefed on but never challenged, about gaslighting he'd benefited from but never questioned, about restrictions on his son's mother that he'd accepted as necessary protocol, about psychological warfare waged against the woman he'd married, conducted in his name with his tacit consent, about charitable work undermined by the institution he represented, about fears for his children that mirrored his own unvoiced terrors. And in letter 7, he read Diana speaking directly to William and Harry in words she could never say to him. Words that revealed a mother's love operating entirely outside the institution's frameworks. A love that saw the machine clearly, a love that grieved its power over her sons, a love that wrote in code so that love might outlast the machine's capacity to erase it. Charles read that letter twice, set the transcript down, placed both hands flat on the table, stared at the leather cover of the original coded letters beside it, and wept. Not the controlled emotion of public mourning, not the dignified sorrow expected of sovereigns, raw, shaking, silent devastation, the kind that comes when truth arrives too late to change anything except the understanding of what was lost. When recognition replaces denial. When grief finally finds its proper object. Not Diana's death, Diana's silencing, not the accident in Paris, the systematic erasure that preceded it, not the tragedy everyone mourned, the injustice no one acknowledged. Charles wept for that injustice, for his role in it, for 30 years of institutional silence that had required his complicity, for the wife whose truth he'd failed to receive when she offered it, for the sons who had grown up believing lies he'd helped sustain, for the woman who had trusted that her words would survive even when her voice could not. He wept because the trust had been honoured, because the words had survived, because the truth had arrived, and because arriving now 30 years late it could not undo what had been done, could only demand that what comes next be different. Charles remained in the archive for 2 hours after reading the letters, alone, with the transcript, with the originals, with the silence. When he emerged, his face bore traces of what he'd experienced, but no performance of it.
He did not summon staff, did not issue instructions, did not explain.
He walked directly to his private study, closed the door, sat at his desk, and waited. He was waiting for William. He had sent word through his private secretary. Ask him to come, now, alone. William arrived within 30 minutes. He entered the study, found his father seated at the desk, the sealed folder before him. Charles did not offer greetings, did not provide context. He pushed the folder across the desk, said 3 words, read them yourself. William opened the folder, read the transcript, all 7 letters, in sequence, without interruption. His face remained composed throughout, but those who know him recognize the composition as containment. The stillness. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked nothing. She was right about everything. The surveillance, the gaslighting, the restrictions, the undermining, the silencing. She was right, and I let it happen. Not actively, not maliciously, but passively, complicitly, through silence, through acceptance, through belief that the institution knew better than she did, through conviction that stability required her diminishment. She was right, and I was wrong, and our sons paid the price, and she paid the ultimate price, and I have spent 30 years mourning her death while avoiding mourning my failure. These letters end that avoidance. They require acknowledgement, not private, institutional, public, full, without qualification, without defence, without the reflex to protect the system at the expense of her truth. William's response was measured, compassionate, and institutionally precise. He said, "I've suspected much of this, felt its effects, carried its consequences. But suspicion is not confirmation. Feeling is not documentation. Consequences is not accountability. These letters provide what suspicion, feeling, and consequence could not: her voice, her record, her truth, in her words, preserved by her hand, trusted to the future. We owe her more than private grief. We owe her public acknowledgement, not as scandal, as testimony, not as indictment, as foundation, not as weapon against the institution, as mirror held to it. You're right. Acknowledgement must be full, unqualified, undefended, but it must also be constructive, oriented toward repair, not merely confession, toward learning, not merely lamentation, toward ensuring that what was done to her cannot be done to anyone again. Let me help you frame that acknowledgement. Let Catherine help. Let us carry this together, not as burden, as inheritance, as the truth she entrusted to us, as the foundation for what comes next."
Charles nodded, slowly, deeply, the nod of a man who has carried weight alone for decades and is finally, tentatively permitting others to share it. The nod of a father accepting his son's partnership in reckoning.
The nod of a sovereign acknowledging that the institution he leads must evolve through honest confrontation with its own history. The nod of a husband receiving his wife's truth at last and committing to honour it, not through private remorse, but through institutional transformation. Catherine's role in the aftermath was characteristically strategic and deeply human. She read the letters that evening, in private, with William beside her. She did not weep, she absorbed, processed, integrated. When she finished, she said, "These letters are not evidence for prosecution. They are testimony for reconciliation. Diana wrote them not to destroy the institution, but to ensure it could eventually become worthy of the love she gave it despite everything. Our task is not to publish them as exposé, it is to integrate their truth into institutional practice, to acknowledge publicly what they document privately,
To commit visibly to the reforms they implicitly demand.
to honour her not through memorialisation alone, but through transformation. Her truth deserves more than our tears. It deserves our action. Action that ensures no woman in this institution is ever again silenced, surveilled, gaslit, restricted, undermined, or erased. Action that ensures her son's children inherit an institution that has learned from her suffering rather than merely commemorating it. William agreed. Charles agreed. Together they began crafting an acknowledgement that would honour Diana's truth without exploiting it. That would serve institutional learning without reducing her testimony to case study. That would transform private devastation into public commitment. That would make her silenced voice the foundation for institutional voice restored. The public acknowledgement came 6 weeks after the letters were decoded. Embedded within the annual Royal Foundation report, framed not as revelation but as continuation of ongoing institutional reflection. The statement read, "As part of our continuing commitment to institutional learning and accountability, we have undertaken review of historical materials relating to the experiences of Diana, Princess of Wales, during her service. These materials include personal writings that document systemic failures in how the institution supported her well-being, respected her agency, and honoured her contributions. We acknowledge these failures fully, without qualification or defence. We recognise that the institution fell short of the standards it aspires to, and that this shortfall caused profound harm. We commit to integrating lessons from this review into current and future practice, ensuring that all who serve this institution are supported, respected, and heard. We honour Diana's memory not only through commemoration, but through demonstrable change. Her truth matters. Her experience matters. Her legacy matters. And we will strive to build an institution worthy of all three." The statement did not quote the letters, did not detail specific allegations, did not name individuals, but everyone who understood the institution understood what it acknowledged. The media parsed it carefully. Constitutional commentators recognized its significance. Royal insiders acknowledged its courage. The public received it not as weakness, but as strength, as evidence that the monarchy could face its own history honestly, that it could acknowledge harm without collapsing, that it could honor truth without sacrificing survival, that it could evolve through reckoning rather than resist through denial. The letters themselves remain sealed. Charles insisted, as condition of any acknowledgement, that they not be published, not in full, not in excerpt, not in authorized biography. His reasoning, articulated privately to William and Catherine, was precise. These letters were written for our sons, not for public consumption, not for historical record, not for media exploitation.
Publishing them would violate her privacy in the very act of honouring her truth. Her testimony must inform institutional reform, must shape public acknowledgement, must guide future practice. But the letters themselves belong to her memory, to her sons, to the silence she chose to break only for them. We honour her by protecting what she protected, by sharing her truth without consuming her, by learning from her testimony without commodifying her pain. William and Catherine agreed. The letters remain in the Windsor archive, accessible only to direct descendants under conditions they jointly determine. Their contents inform institutional review. Their truths shape reform commitments. Their existence serves as permanent reminder that institutional integrity requires both acknowledgement and protection, both transparency and reverence, both learning and love. What does this story tell us about the monarchy? It tells us that the institution's greatest vulnerability is not external criticism, but internal silence. Silence around harm done to those within its walls. Silence around systemic failures disguised as tradition. Silence around truths too uncomfortable to face, too dangerous to speak, too costly to acknowledge. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, scandals, deaths, but it cannot survive accumulated, unacknowledged harm. Each generation inherits not just the crown, but the unresolved weight of previous generations' silences. Charles inherited Elizabeth's silence about his preparation. William inherited Charles's silence about Diana's treatment. Each silence compounded, each burden accumulated, until the weight became unsustainable, until truth surfaced, not through institutional initiative, but through accidental discovery, through conservators finding a lockbox behind a wall, through archivists decoding shorthand in a sealed room, through a king reading his dead wife's words, and finally, fully breaking open. The institution survives not because it avoids truth, but because truth eventually finds its way through accidents, through codes, through hidden boxes, through locked rooms, through tears shed in silence, through acknowledgements offered in public, through commitments made to do better, through transformations undertaken in honesty, through love expressed through accountability, through truth honoured through act. It tells us that Diana's agency extends beyond her death. She is often portrayed as victim, as tragic figure, as woman destroyed by forces larger than herself. And she was. But she was also witness, recorder, preserver, woman who, even in her most isolated, most surveilled, most institutionally suffocated moments, retained capacity to document, to encode, to hide, to trust that truth would outlast silence. Her letters are not evidence of victimhood. They are evidence of resistance, of refusal to be erased, of determination that her sons would know truth even if she could not tell them herself. That resistance, exercised in secret, in code, in fear, in grief, was extraordinary courage. And it was that courage, preserved across 30 years, that ultimately reshaped the institution that tried to extinguish it. Diana did not destroy the monarchy, but she ensured it could not continue unchanged. Her letters were not weapon. They were mirrors. And when Charles looked into that mirror, he saw what the institution had done, could not look away, could not reign unchanged, had to break open, had to acknowledge, had to commit to difference, had to honour her truth through institutional transformation. Her resistance lives, in decoded words, in public acknowledgement, in reform commitments, in institutional evolution, in grandchildren who will inherit an institution shaped by their grandmother's silenced voice finally heard. It tells us that Charles's tears were not weakness. They were necessary rupture, necessary breaking of 30-year containment, necessary reception of truth, long deferred, necessary grief finding its proper object, necessary acknowledgement replacing denial, necessary humanity surfacing through sovereign composure, necessary love expressing itself through devastation,
Necessary reckoning beginning in private before manifesting in public. His tears were not failure of kingship, they were fulfillment of humanity, of husbandhood, of fatherhood, of moral responsibility, of institutional accountability, of love for a woman whose truth he'd failed to receive in life and finally received in death, of commitment to honouring that truth through transformation rather than mere remembrance, of willingness to let personal devastation serve institutional renewal, of courage to face what he'd avoided, of humility to accept what he'd denied, of love sufficient to break him open, of love sufficient to rebuild differently. His tears were not end, they were beginning of honest reckoning, beginning of institutional learning, beginning of transformation rooted in truth, beginning of legacy defined not by perfection, but by progress, not by avoidance, but by acknowledgement, not by silence, but by speech, not by preservation of image, but by pursuit of integrity. It tells us that William and Catherine represent new model of royal leadership, one rooted in institutional honesty rather than ceremonial mystique. They are not content to inherit crown as is, committed to inheriting it examined, understood, improved. Their willingness to facilitate Charles's confrontation with Diana's truth is not disrespect. It is highest form of respect for her, for him, for institution, for future. It says we take this seriously enough to confront its flaws. We honour your service enough to learn from its costs. We love this institution enough to demand better of ourselves than was demanded of you. This is not rebellion. It is stewardship. Stewardship requiring courage, humility, willingness to discomfort, present in service of future. Stewardship that understands institutional survival depends not on maintaining illusions, but on practicing honesty. Not on avoiding reckoning, but on embracing it. Not on preserving silence, but on breaking it when silence becomes liability. Their leadership models what the monarchy must become, capable of self-examination, of growth, of learning from its own history rather than merely performing, capable of honouring truth without sacrificing survival, of acknowledging harm without collapsing, of evolving through reckoning rather than resisting through denial. What do you think? Was the palace lockdown justified to protect the integrity of the decoding process, or does such secrecy contradict the transparency the letters demand? Should Diana's coded letters ever be published, in whole or in part, or does protecting her privacy outweigh public interest in full disclosure? Can institutional acknowledgement without specific detail constitute meaningful accountability, or does vagueness perpetuate the very silencing the letters protest? Is Charles's emotional response sufficient demonstration of reckoning, or must accountability be measured solely through structural reform? And what does this story reveal about the relationship between individual testimony and institutional transformation in systems designed to suppress both? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and this story, more than any we have covered, demands the community's judgment. If you want to stay ahead of the royal stories the mainstream media will not touch, make sure you are subscribed to turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most important discoveries are not made in spotlight but in sealed rooms. That the most powerful truths are not shouted but whispered in code. That the most courageous acts are not public declarations but private reckonings. That the most loving gestures are not memorials but transformations. Because in the House of Windsor, the crown passes by law, but truth passes through silence, through codes, through hidden boxes, through locked rooms, through tears shed in solitude, through acknowledgements offered in public, through commitments made to do better, through institutions catching up to truths long buried, through fathers breaking open so sons might build differently, through mothers speaking across decades in voices finally heard. Through grandchildren inheriting futures shaped by grandmothers' silenced words. Truth is the inheritance. Truth is the letter. Truth is the code. Truth is the lockbox. Truth is the archive. Truth is the decoding. Truth is the lockdown. Truth is the reading. Truth is the tears. Truth is the acknowledgement. Truth is the commitment. Truth is the transformation. Truth is Diana. Truth is Charles. Truth is William. Truth is Catherine. Truth is the humility to receive. Truth is the love that breaks open.
Truth is the reckoning that rebuilds.
Truth is the silence broken. Truth is the voice restored. Truth is the testimony honored. Truth is the legacy transformed. Truth is forever. Stay curious, stay informed, stay questioning. And remember, every hidden box holds truth waiting to be found. Every coded letter carries voice waiting to be heard. Every sealed room contains reckoning waiting to occur. Until next time, keep your eyes on the walls that yield their secrets, and your hearts open to the truths that have waited decades to be received. Because the wall is the hiding place. The hiding place is the lockbox. The lockbox is the letter. The letter is the code. The code is the voice. The voice is Diana. Diana is the truth. Truth is the decoding. Decoding is the lockdown. Lockdown is the reading. Reading is the tears. Tears are the reckoning. Reckoning is the acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is the commitment. Commitment is the transformation. Transformation is the future. Future is the institution. Institution is the crown. Crown is the stewardship. Stewardship is the honesty. Honesty is the survival. Survival is the evolution. Evolution is the tradition fulfilled. Tradition fulfilled is the continuity secured. Continuity secured is the clarity achieved. Clarity achieved is the truth honored. Truth honored is Diana remembered. Diana remembered is the voice restored. Voice restored is the testimony integrated. Testimony integrated is the legacy transformed. Legacy transformed is the future built. Future built is the grandchildren's inheritance. Grandchildren's inheritance is the truth carried forward. Truth carried forward is the silence filled. Silence filled is the voice heard. Voice heard is the Diana. Diana is the mother. Mother is the love. Love is the resistance. Resistance is the survival. Survival is the letter. Letter is the code. Code is the truth. Truth is the forever. Forever is the voice. Voice is the testimony. Testimony is the reckoning. Reckoning is the transformation.
Transformation is the future.
Future is the truth. Truth is Diana. Diana is forever. The letters rest now in the Windsor archive, sealed, protected, accessible only to those for whom they were written. Their pages are not consumed by public gaze. Their words are not commodified. Their truth is not reduced to headlines or soundbites. They exist as Diana intended, as private testimony for her sons, preserved against institutional forces that sought to erase her. And in that preservation, she wins, not posthumously, not symbolically. Actually, her voice survives, her record endures, her truth shapes the future, not through publication, through presence, through quiet, persistent, unassailable fact of her having written, encoded, hidden, trusted that truth would outlast silence, and it did, through lockbox behind wall, through conservators who found what was meant to be lost, through archivists who decoded what was meant to be unread, through king who read what was meant for his sons, through prince who ascends with mother's truth as compass, through princess who translates grief into governance, through institution that, however reluctantly, begins to reckon. Diana's victory is not loud, not triumphant, not celebratory. It is quiet, persistent, unassailable, like the letters themselves, like the truth they contain, like the voice that speaks across 30 years of silence and says, still, to anyone willing to listen, I was here, I was silenced, I was not mad, I was not difficult, I was not the problem. The problem was the institution, and the institution must change, and it is changing, because I wrote, because I hid, because I trusted, because truth survives, because I survive, in the letters, in the code, in the lockbox, in the archive, in the sons, in the reckoning, in the transformation, in the future, in the truth, in the silence broken, in the voice heard, in the testimony honored, in the
Legacy transformed, in Diana, in forever. Goodbye.